live thoughts, but also obviously available afterwards, offline, if you just get any great ideas or just want to have anything more offline conversations with them. So if we're all ready, I'm going to hand over to you guys. Enjoy. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Well, welcome everybody to the last session of the day. As Beth said, the future of fundraising is the topic, and myself, Nick and Steph work at Oaks, and we both work with a variety of different clients covering lots and lots of different income streams. So there's quite a lot of information we're going to be giving you in a relatively short period of time. So apologies in advance if it does appear a little overwhelming, but we're contactable afterwards. So and at the end of the presentation there will be time for questions. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. So we're just going to start off by giving a little bit of an overview about the current climate around fundraising and what it looks like and the impact that the pandemic has had. We'll talk a bit about what fundraising in schools means and looks like. We'll then talk about some examples of what fundraising could and should look like moving forward, finishing with some top tips, and then open up the session to any questions. Type away in terms of questions throughout the presentation, and we'll pick them all up at the end. Next slide, please. So the current landscape, not surprisingly, fundraising across the entire sector, so not just fundraising in the education sector, has been massively negatively impacted on the whole. There have been some positives that have come out of it, but a lot of fundraising has suffered because of things like, obviously, face-to-face interactions have not been allowed, so lots of events, which you have probably experienced from the school's perspective, so summer fairs being cancelled, Easter parades, you know, even things like non-uniform days because children haven't necessarily been in school have not been able to happen. There's increased competition for donors, so pretty much every charitable cause out there has launched an emergency appeal throughout this pandemic. So the ask of individuals in every community has been huge to support, you know, various different causes. Individuals themselves have had financial worries. Some people have unfortunately lost their jobs, others have been placed on furlough. Others whose jobs have been secure have maybe just been not so keen to spend their money because they're saving it because nobody knows what the future looks like or when a new normal may arise for us. Certain causes have seen decreases in people's giving. Now, this is an ever-changing landscape. So at the time we prepared the presentation, organisations such as international causes, children's charities and animal welfare were seeing the biggest decrease in income. And not surprisingly, organisations related to the NHS, related to local hospices and local charities, so lots of food banks, for example, were seeing increases in support. There was and still is amongst some people a view that statutory funded organisations are fine. So some charities do receive statutory funding. Obviously, as a school, lots of fundraising may have been impacted because people have felt that there are other organisations that are more deserving or in need of donations at the moment. And the grants landscape, which is traditionally quite a stable landscape in terms of understanding exactly what the criteria is for putting in applications to trusts and foundations, has been constantly evolving and changing almost on a daily basis. And we're going to go into that in a bit more detail. So you've got to really be understanding on a daily basis what is happening to know what funders to apply to and what sort of grants are available. Next slide, please. So when we talk about fundraising in schools, traditionally we're looking at community-based fundraising. So a lot of the fundraising is done through parents, through the local communities, through the staff at the school and the children and the pupils themselves. A lot of the fundraising is events focused. So as I just mentioned earlier, a few examples around summer fairs, Christmas fairs, Mother's Day parades. So lots of the fundraising is done physically and therefore is traditionally offline. So it is, you know, money being spent at events as opposed to money being donated or events being accessed in a digital space. A lot of fundraising is, in some cases, 100% driven by PTAs or friends groups linked to the schools. In other cases, fundraising is completely driven and by the school, and there isn't a PTA or a friends group attached. But generally, most organisations will have some kind of link to a PTA. The focus should be for schools on income generation, so not just fundraising. So when we talk about fundraising, we interchange with the terminology income generation. So fundraising is traditionally viewed in the sense of fundraising activity, events, sponsored walks, silences, spellathons, etc. But actually income generation can be any additional income that comes into the school or academy that can be used for any social good or social impact and well-being of children. And an example of that is you heard about asset utilisation earlier on in the day from School Space as one example of income generation into the school that doesn't sit neatly into that fundraising space. But when we talk about fundraising in schools, we are talking about any sort of additional income you can bring in. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to hand over to Steph, who's one of our bid writers here at Oaks, and he's just going to talk you through grant fundraising in schools.
Yeah, so as Nic mentioned, the fundraising landscape is extremely competitive. That's the case with grant funding as well. Even in normal circumstances, schools are faced with significant challenges when trying to access grant funding support. And since the COVID-19 lockdown, we found that a large number of funders who have a track record in supporting schools have suspended all their grant funding streams and sort of drifted their attention towards supporting projects that have a direct link to COVID-19. One example would be the National Lottery, who for years have allocated significant investment in education through their Awards for All program. But as of April, they've decided to concentrate all their efforts on reviewing COVID-19 projects. And unfortunately for the education sector, schools are not eligible to apply. Again, similar to the National Lottery, we found the same case with Sport England, who have paused their small grants scheme and launched an emergency fund. I mean, it's not sort of on the positive side. There are still funders out there who have decided to continue their usual grant giving regardless of the current context. For example, we have funders like the Garfield Weston Foundation who still give out grants like both capital and revenue. We have people like Bailey Thomas Foundation who are still accepting applications from schools who work specifically with children with learning disabilities. Schools in the West Midlands, for example, can now apply again for the Severn Trent Community Fund, which has recently reopened. So there are still several local, regional, and national opportunities that school can apply for. But again, it becomes more and more competitive, and people have to, schools have to come up with really, really innovative ideas for them to be successful. During this time, and sort of despite these challenges, we have tried to work with schools closely and sort of encourage them to stay positive and use this time to perhaps reflect on what financial support they actually need, especially from September onwards. So we've been advising schools to engage in community consultation to children, to families, find out what can be improved in terms of remote learning. And this has enabled schools so far to build a bank of project ideas that can be used in future funding applications. And a good example with one of our partner schools, they've managed to build a relationship with lots of local charities, youth groups, as well as a company that manages a digital platform for physical activities. So in sort of partnership with them, they managed to work together to submit funding applications, even though the funding might not necessarily be going to the school account. It's still that children that will ultimately benefit from this community consultation. So while community consultation is extremely useful, it's also important to be aware of expectations beyond COVID-19. And we anticipate that there will be fewer opportunities, and the ones available will probably be a bit smaller. Just to give you an example, the average grant tends to be around £10,000, so this is likely to be reduced. And And the reason for that is probably a lot of funders have injected a lot of investment into COVID-19 projects, so they're sort of running out of funding in this financial year. But hopefully things will sort of go back to normal in the near future. But again, we spoke about lots of challenges and issues around grant funding support. But I think, just to reiterate my point, it's good for schools to use this time wisely, speak to local organizations, speak to their families and children, and build those ideas that in the future they'll be better able to use these findings and use them within the narrative of all funding applications, because the grant funding landscape will become even more and more competitive in the future. So you have to be innovative as much as you can, so you can stand out and be successful in terms of grant funding.
Great, thanks, Steph. We can move on to the next slide, please. So another area of fundraising for schools is local organisations, corporates, so the commercial sector. And this diagram just shows different categories of support that you can ask for. So corporate social responsibility, so this is linked to organisations that have some kind of charity of the year, or their organisation takes part in employee fundraising, and you as a school, for maybe a particular project or through your PTA, who may be a registered charity, can apply or ask for donations. As I say, maybe linked to a particular project that you're running in the school. Advertising, so schools are quite often placed in some fantastic locations that get lots of footfall, lots of traffic going by. They might have facilities that are used by the general public. So you've got some great spaces and opportunities to sell advertising space, obviously linked in with what your principles and values of a school are and the sorts of organisations you'd like to be associated with. But, you know, railings alongside roads, for example, you could sell banner space to local businesses to advertise their services as a way to generate income. Procurement partners, so not strictly income generation, but every school, every trust, every academy will have a list of suppliers that it purchases from. So this is a warm network that you have that should be a go-to with any fundraising ask that you have. So if you're looking to refurbish your playground equipment, for example, or you're looking to fund a school trip, maybe for pupils that can't afford to go, your first port of call really should be your warm networks that you already have a contact at. Not only that, never be afraid to try, contract kind of terms and conditions, if they allow, to renegotiate and get the best possible procurement deal and save some money as well, because if you're spending less, you've got more money available to spend elsewhere, and that could be on those nice to have or those wish to have projects or pieces of equipment for your school. And then finally, value in kind and networking. So make sure you're getting along to local business networking events, whether that's breakfast briefings, whether that's through your local chambers. Just get your school and your projects out there and in front of local businesses, because they can't support you if they don't know who you are. And it's all about starting to build relationships and build trust. And then value in kind, so these are the sorts of things that you can get that aren't monetary and financial. So an organisation might not be able to give you £1,000 towards a school trip, but they might be able to give you £500 worth of free stationery that you otherwise would have to buy. Or we've worked with schools where they've had relationships with food manufacturers. So to support some of their food technology classes, they've been able to get free food and free pieces of equipment rather than a monetary donation. So these are all the different ways that you can work with local businesses and organisations. And if you're not doing it, then you really need to start to think about how you can incorporate that into your school kind of funding strategy. Next slide, please. And this flowchart just demonstrates the steps to go through. So understand what it is that you have to offer. So why should local business A support you? So do you have a particular program? What's your USP? So just make sure that you've got that front of mind. Who are you going to target? So be aware that actually there might be some businesses you don't want to be associated with. So actually understand the sorts of organisations you want to go after. Why us? So because we can offer them good PR, we can offer them, you know, shout outs on our social media, we can offer them access to maybe, you know, the head teacher for a meeting. Quite often there's lots of things that you can offer a corporate partner that will be really attractive to them. How and when to make the ask. So perhaps don't start sending out proposals or making asks before you're about to go, break up for the Easter holidays for 2 weeks, so you're not there to actually respond to any queries that come back, or you're contacting local retailers in the run up to Christmas when they're absolutely run off their feet themselves with their own business. So just think about how and when to make the ask. Should it be face to face? Who should be the person to make the ask? And then just go out there and ask. Don't just send a letter, not hear anything back, and think that's the end of it. Remember, you won't be the priority for any corporate organisation. Their normal day-to-day business will be their priority. But just because you don't hear back doesn't mean it's a no. So persevere is definitely a piece of advice we would give. Next slide, please. And then we move on to digital fundraising. So this really is the future of fundraising, not just for schools potentially, but for the entire sector. Lockdown has forced the agenda and has made lots of charities who had, a digital transformation strategy, planned, just execute it a lot sooner because they've had to take all their fundraising online. And there are examples of where schools have been really successful at doing this as well. So there's a school based down the road from me actually, and they took their summer fair online. So they changed it obviously from a face-to-face event to a Facebook event. They live streamed on the day, they ran competitions online. Parents and students had to send in, pictures of their cake for the best cake sale. They did keepy uppy competitions and sent in videos of their children. It was live. There was live streaming going on all day from various different teachers, and they really made the most of what they were able to do at the time, and they still managed to raise over £1,000. And they had an online raffle, etc. So just try and be creative and not just think, well, we can't have that event face to face anymore, therefore we can't do it at all. Obviously, quizzes are another example where it's very easy to translate what would have been a face to face event into the digital space. Just move on to the next slide, please. So digital fundraising. So when we talk about digital fundraising, we're talking about any activity using a piece of equipment, a piece of technology online. And nowadays that primarily means our smartphones. So some people still do engage regularly on tablets or laptops, even desktop devices, but generally people kind of live their lives through their smartphone. So just be aware that if you are doing any fundraising online, is whatever you're doing or the platform you're using compatible with mobile devices. And really the benefit to digital fundraising is it's a way to make relatively small asks but to big audiences, but the end result can be really quite astounding in terms of donations or interactions, or just conversations with people in your local community and getting your school name or your school project out there. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of these different types of digital fundraising, but as you can see from this page alone, there are lots and lots of different ways to engage online and raise money online. Some of them you will have heard of and come across probably in your personal lives as well. You've probably all supported a crowdfunding campaign at some point. Click to Give, a lot of people probably use Amazon Smile or Easy Fundraising. Social media, Facebook is still the most popular social media platform for fundraising online, and if you actually go onto Facebook, they've got a whole section on their website about social impact and how you can use all the various donation mechanisms to raise money. So I would definitely recommend you go and check that out. So as I say, I'm not going to go through them all, but there are lots and lots of different ways to raise money online. And if you're not already thinking about how you can do that from September onwards, then I would really recommend you do start having a think, because the traditional fundraising in schools is going to have to change and adapt. Next slide, please. So before we go on to questions for the last 10 minutes, just a few top tips from us. So invest to grow, and by this we mean invest either time or money. So quite often organisations, schools, charities want to raise money and fundraise and think that that will just happen. They'll just put an email out and people will respond and they'll get money. And you do have to have some level of investment, whether that is investing time for someone to drive a fundraising campaign, or money, for example, to boost Facebook ads, or to, even print off, materials that you might want to distribute in your local community. Communicate really powerfully. So with any fundraising ask or fundraising campaign that you're putting together, really consider, how do you want the person that receives that information to think? So what sort of emotions do you want it to trigger? How do you want them to feel? And therefore, how do you want them to act? So make sure there's a call to action. So you can have a great case study about why your school needs their money. You can trigger all the right emotions of, oh my goodness, yeah, absolutely, I need to support this cause and help this group of children. But if you don't then tell people what you want to do, then they don't know what to do with that. So, direct them to maybe your Just Giving site, or direct them to send in a donation in a different way. Create a relationship. So whether that's with grant funders, whether that's with local businesses, whether that's with the PTA that's fundraising for your school, the stronger and the bigger the relationship that you have with people, the more likely they are to support you, not just once, but multiple times, and support you potentially, to a larger value than they did previously. Make it easy to give. People are incredibly time poor. So if it's actually really complicated, or you only accept checks, and I know that seems a bit crazy, but my son's school, I still have to send in a check for things. I actually had to contact the bank to get a checkbook because I didn't have one anymore. So just think about how you're asking people to donate and support, and make it really easy. To be the best, you have to test. It's okay if you try a fundraising event, or if you try, an online lottery, and it doesn't work. That's okay. That happens all the time in the world of fundraising. But the charities and the schools that are the most successful at fundraising will have tried lots of different things before they hit something that really worked for them. What does the donation buy? So as much information and information that leads to impact that you can give people who have donated as possible is critical. So let people know that their £10 will fund XYZ, or make sure that they know they're contributing, towards a collective that will fund XYZ. And that sounds really obvious, but actually lots of organisations don't do that. And what lots of organisations also don't do is say thank you. Again, really, really obvious, but the number one reason that donors in general don't tend to give again, and this does happen in the education sector as well, is because they're not thanked. So be creative. It doesn't have to be a thank you letter that gets posted out. It could be maybe your students or your pupils creating a little thank you video that gets sent out on social media, or emailed out by Parent Pay, or whatever mechanism you may use. It could be a message from the governors. It could be a message, from a teacher rep. But just be as creative as possible in saying your thank yous, because you do want your parents and your local community to continue to support you. So that's our presentation, and we have got a few minutes left at the end. We've got about 6 minutes left, I think. So if there's any questions that have come in, we're happy to answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nic and Steph. That was absolutely fantastic and covered a lot there. So we've had some diverse questions obviously come in, as you would expect, because you did cover quite a lot of scope.
Yep.
I think this one goes back to Steph, when we were talking around the grant opportunities, although not specifically for grant, but I am going to frame it in that mind. Steph, in your experience, do you think that schools should be really thinking, or perhaps be a little bit more willing to be thinking about how their ideas are really embedded in the community, so the community-based projects on school grounds that aren't just necessarily for the benefits for the pupils, but also wider other groups within the community, and how that might work for grant funding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to showcase why the community benefit within your grant funding applications gives you a better chance of success. And the reason for that is most grant giving organizations, they don't want to see their donations as replacing statutory funding. So you, as a school, you have to open your facilities to the wider community, bringing kids from outside your school, perhaps bringing families, outside the catchment area of your school. So yeah, absolutely. And I guess there is, understandably, there are some safeguarding concerns, and we've seen this in the past with head teachers being a bit reluctant to do this. But I think with the right risk assessment in place, you'll definitely be able to launch and run sort of community-based activities. So yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic. And I think Nic, this is probably one for you, and probably more around the digital aspect, but who do you think is best placed within a school or a multi-academy trust to actually lead on something like a digital event or a digital campaign? Is it the teachers? Is it the support staff? Is it the PTA? Who do you think should be involved and lead on it?
And it's a good question, and there probably will be a different answer dependent on how different schools and academies are set up. But I would definitely say getting buy-in from a teacher to lead on fundraising or a fundraising project is a really, really good idea. And quite often, newly qualified teachers or those that are quite early on in their career are really active in terms of wanting to further develop themselves and their own skill set. So it can be a really great project to give a newly qualified teacher. But what I would say is don't just expect one person in a school to be able to drive fundraising. There might be one person that leads on it, but it will need to be a team effort to some degree. But include the pupils as well. So it might actually be that a teacher leads a pupil, fundraising forum, or a charity. There might be charity champions that are based within the student population as well. So there's lots of different kind of methods that you can use, but definitely having I think one teacher to really lead with support from either other staff or pupils is a good idea.
Thank you. And final question, which I mean, you might not know the answer, but we'll go out there. Top tips, quick wins. Have either of you got the thought of just a quick win in your experience that have worked really well for schools and their fundraising?
For me, it's really basic. It's actually just putting an ask out to parents. So just put a monetary ask out there to parents. If you want a quick win, developing a fundraising campaign or setting up a crowdfunder or trying to arrange an event isn't that quick. So actually, if you communicate powerfully and you let parents and the wider community know what the impact is and what their money can buy, then actually that can be really powerful in itself. But the other thing I've seen, which isn't necessarily a quick win, but work really effectively for primary and the early years of primary, is a milk money campaign. So in the first few years of primary school, obviously children are able to access milk for free. So for the families that can afford it, it can be a really effective way to say, if you were paying, it would have cost you this. Would you mind making that a donation instead? So it kind of links it back to something that they know their child is benefiting from. But it will depend on the school audience and obviously your community and what sort of area of deprivation you're in. But don't assume that a parent won't donate because you are in an area of deprivation. Make the ask and let them make the decision.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Unless there's any other kind of thoughts from you?
No, I mean, the kind of the leave. Oh, I can't get my words out. The leaving comment from me is just give fundraising a go. Don't be put off because you might think that you're doing it wrong or that you might not raise a lot of money first time round. Just give it a go, test, learn. Join forums. There's lots and lots of fundraising that happens out there. Lots of schools are really successful at it. So if you spot a school being really successful, just drop them a line and ask them what they're doing and how. And likewise for us, if there's any follow-up questions, myself and Steph are more than happy to answer them after today.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. We'll leave it there. Really appreciate your time. And again, you took the words right out of my mouth, but you are there to help and have taken